Welcome to the React plus TypeScript Essential Training, your gateway to mastering the powerful combination of React with TypeScript for building dynamic, real-world applications. This course is specially designed for beginners, aiming to teach you the most important concepts of React and TypeScript in the quickest and most straightforward way possible. This course serves as your all-in-one guide, covering the fundamentals and essential techniques in creating apps using React paired with TypeScript. We start with the basics of creating React components, styling, efficient state management, handling and building React forms effectively. But our journey doesn't end there. We'll advance to developing single-page applications, or SPAs, equipping you with the skills to create responsive, user-friendly interfaces. As we progress, the course will unveil how to integrate your application with a backend API and reveal the steps to deploying your project online, making it accessible to users worldwide. My name is Glenn Raya, your instructor for this course. With almost 14 years of experience as a full-stack web developer, I've honed my skills in PHP, Laravel, CSS, React, TypeScript, and more. I'm passionate about using these technologies to build meaningful web applications and equally enthusiastic about sharing my knowledge with you. Let's dive into the world of web development together and turn your curiosity into expertise. So, let's get started. Before taking this course, you should have at least a basic knowledge of the following: HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. You don't need to know how to code in React to take this course. However, if you are already comfortable writing code in the following languages I mentioned, you are ready to take this course. Also, we are going to use TypeScript along with React. If you are not familiar with TypeScript, that's okay, as I will guide you throughout the course. And yes, you don't need to know TypeScript as well to take this course. Though, if you have some familiarity with TypeScript, or if you have written some code with it, it will be a great help. TypeScript is a strict syntactical superset of JavaScript and adds optional static typing to the language. This can help us catch errors even before we run our code. TypeScript's type system enhances the development experience with features like code completion, interface checking, and refactoring tools in many code editors. In the next video, we will set up our development environment, and I will make some recommendations for a better development experience. What is React? React is a popular open-source JavaScript library used for building dynamic and reactive user interfaces, especially for single-page applications. It was developed by Facebook, now Meta, and is maintained by Facebook and a community of individual developers and companies. React allows developers to create large web applications that can change data without reloading the page. Its key feature is the ability to create reusable UI components, which helps in maintaining the code when working on large-scale projects. The software engineers at Facebook created React in 2011 and released it as an open-source project in 2013, with the following goals in mind. Simplifying UI development. Breaking down the UI into reusable components made development faster and more manageable. Enhancing performance. React's virtual DOM, or the document object model, efficiently updates only the necessary parts of the UI, leading to smoother performance. Improving code maintainability. Modular components with clear logic made the code easier to understand and modify. Imagine building your UI with Legos. Each Lego block represents a component, a self-contained piece of code that renders a specific part of the interface. You combine these components to form pages, sections, and ultimately your entire application. That's essentially what React does. React is one of the most popular front-end JavaScript libraries. It is used by companies like Airbnb, Netflix, Uber, and many others to build their web applications. You can also build native mobile apps for iOS or Android using a technology called React Native, which uses the React library under the hood to build native mobile interfaces. So, if you're looking for a job as a front-end developer, or you are aspiring to create mobile applications using React Native, then it's a must-have skill. As you progress in this course, you'll uncover the intricacies of building a component, managing states, styling your components, working with forms, deploying your code to production environments, and more. Before we start coding, I'd like to quickly review how to set up our development environment and offer some recommendations for an enhanced development experience. Firstly, to develop apps using React, it's essential to install Node.js. Please visit the official Node.js website at nodejs.org, download and install the latest version. The installation process is the same for both macOS and Windows. Once Node.js is installed, confirm its installation by opening your terminal and typing node-v. If a version number appears, such as 20.11 in my case, Node.js has been installed correctly. Note that the version may vary depending on when you are watching this lesson. Regarding the choice of code editor, it's largely a matter of personal preference. If you're undecided, I recommend the two options. The first is Visual Studio Code, or VS Code, a free open-source editor developed by Microsoft. It's powerful, user-friendly, and highly customizable. The second option is Sublime Text, a well-known modern code editor. While not free, Sublime Text offers an unlimited trial period, allowing you to try it without a cost. For this course, I'll use VS Code, but feel free to use any code editor you're comfortable with. If you choose Visual Studio Code, I recommend several extensions. The first is the ES7 Plus React Redux React Native Snippets extension for code autocompletion and shortcuts. Install the extension via the Extensions panel, in the View menu, or using the shortcut Command-Shift-X or Control-Shift-X on Windows. Another useful extension is called Auto Rename Tag, which automatically renames closing tags when you rename an opening tag. The Highlight Matching Tag extension is also helpful, highlighting matching opening and closing tags in your code. Lastly, the Prettier extension is highly recommended. This is a very popular extension that will format your code for you. It will format the code according to the rules you set in the Prettier config file. This is very useful when you are working on a team, so everyone can write code in the same style. And for me, it's very convenient because it will automatically format the code for me according to my coding style preference. Remember, these extensions are optional and not mandatory for this course. They are just recommendations. With the development environment now set up, let's begin writing some code. Now it's time to create our first React app. There are a couple of ways you can install a fresh React application. The first option would be via the CRA, or the Create React App package, provided by the React team themselves. If you go to the official React website, on the Learn page, under the Installation section, you can start a new React project using this command, which you should run in your terminal. That's the first option. The second option would be using Vite. Vite is a new tool that allows you to create React applications as well as other JavaScript frameworks. Vite is getting very popular these days because it is very fast in compiling your code to JavaScript and typically has a smaller bundle size than the Create React App package. Head over to vitejs.dev, the official website of Vite, and click on the Get Started button. On this page, you can read more about Vite, and if you scroll down to the middle part of the page, you will see this section called Scaffolding Your First Vite Project. And here's the command you need to run in your terminal to create a React app. I'll copy this. You can install your React project in any location you like. I'm going to create mine on the desktop inside the React folder. I'll paste the command right here and hit Enter or Return key to run it. It will ask us to name our project. I'll name it My First React App, like this. Each word is separated by a dash, but you can name your project anything you like. Next, it will ask us what framework or library we want to use. You can use the up and down keys to navigate between these options. Of course, we will select React and hit Enter or Return. Now in the Select Variant part, we will select TypeScript instead of regular JavaScript. After this, the scaffolding of our React project is done, and as you can see, there are a few instructions that appear on your terminal. Let's go inside our React folder by running this command. cd my first React app, and hit Enter or Return. Now that we are inside our project folder, we need to run npm install to install all the dependencies of our project. I will fast forward this because it may take a while to install everything. Once the installation is finished, we are now ready to run our application. On your terminal, run npm run dev, and you should see this message on your terminal. In order to see our project in action, copy this URL. It might look a little different on your end, depending on where you are running your project. For example, you might see a different port number instead of port 5173. You might be running on a different port number. But regardless, copy this URL and paste it into your browser. And hit enter or return. And you should see this page. This is the default welcome page for our React project. And there's even a simple counter example here when you click this button. Now let's go back to our terminal and let's terminate this process by pressing Ctrl+C. This process will stop our development server. Let's open our project folder in our code editor by running code space dot in your terminal. Now, this process might not work for you. If it doesn't, just simply drag your project folder to your code editor and it should open your project. When you open a fresh React application, you will see the following files and folders. First is the Node Modules folder. This folder is where all the npm packages are installed. Typically, these are your project's dependencies. You don't need to touch this folder. It is also not recommended to modify or delete any of the files here, as this could cause your project to break. And you shouldn't save your files here either. Next is the public folder. This is where your static files are stored, such as images, fonts, CSS files, and other assets that needs to be accessible publicly. Next is the source folder, or SRC for short. This is where your actual application code is stored. As you can see, there are a bunch of files here already, such as the CSS files and the app.tsx file, which is the root component of your application, and the main.tsx file, which is the entry point of your application. The asset folder is an optional folder where you can store assets that needs to be bundled along with your application. Next is the index.html file. This is the main HTML file of your application. As you can see, there is a div with an ID of root. This is where your React application will be rendered. And the main.tsx file, here, as I said before, the entry point of your application. We also have the package.json file, which is where you can configure your project, such as the name, version, description, and other information about your project. This is also where your project's dependencies are defined. As you can see, currently we have two dependencies, which is React itself and the React DOM package, which is responsible for manipulating the virtual DOM. The dev dependencies is where you can define your project's development dependencies, such as the TypeScript compiler, Vite, and other tools that you use while developing your application. Whenever you install a new dependencies, whether it's your project's dependencies or development dependencies, those will be defined here along with their version numbers. Next, we have the tsconfig.json file. This is where you can configure a TypeScript compiler, such as the target version of JavaScript, the module system, and other options. For the most part, you don't need to touch any values here unless you know what you're doing. And lastly, we have the vite.config.js file. This is where you can configure your Vite server. You can define the plugins if there are any. Again, for the most part, you don't need to touch this file. Let's create our first component. Actually, before we start to create our first component, I would like to show you how to set up the prettier config file so it will help us format our code when we save our file. Let's create a file in the root of our project and name it .prettierrc like this. To save us some time, I will just copy and paste the options we are going to use. You can pause the video so you can write these values so you can follow along. The first option is the tab with value. I set this to 4. So what this will do is that every line will be indented 4 spaces. You can see a description when you hover the option name. Next is the single quote option. I set this to true. This will use single quotes instead of double quotes in our React app, but only in certain areas like in strings, in event parameters, and so on. We will see that later on. Next is the semi option. This will omit the semicolon at the end of the statement. Modern JavaScript does not require semicolons, so we can omit them to make our source code a bit cleaner. The arrow parens option, I set this to avoid. What this will do is that it will remove the opening and closing parentheses in a statement where you only have one parameter. We will see that later on as well. And lastly, the trailing comma option will remove the last comma in a collection of properties within an object or arrays or JSON objects. Now it's time to build our first component. In the app.tsx file, as you can see, this is the pre-written code. We will be adding our first component here. Notice when I save this file, it will format the code according to the options we set in the .prettier file. Remember, setting the prettier code formatting is optional. If you don't like how it's formatted, and you prefer something else, feel free to skip using prettier for auto-formatting your code. Let's go to our terminal and let's start our development server by running npm run dev. Again, let's go to this URL it provided us. Now here's the default React page. Let's go back to our code editor and let's remove all of this code so we could start from scratch. Now let's begin by creating the root app component and export this from this module. Like this. And then let's return an h1 tag to start. Let's say hello React. Let's go back to our browser and refresh the page. As you can see, the page is now displaying hello React. As you may notice, it already has some styling applied to this component. Let's quickly remove the default CSS styling so we could really start fresh. The CSS file is usually defined in the entry point of our application, which is inside the main.tsx file, right here. Let's just simply comment this for now and return to our browser. And now, our component is completely unstyled now. We will use a CSS framework in later videos to style our components. But let's keep it simple for now. Now let's create a new component inside the components directory, inside the source folder. This is a pretty common practice and lets you organize different components of your application in a meaningful directory structure, according to their use cases. Inside the components folder, let's create a component called message.tsx file. Inside this file, let's call this component just the same name as its file name, message. Then export this module so we can import this component to other components. For now, let's return just a simple message that says hello from message component, wrapped inside a paragraph tag. Now we are ready to use this component inside our app component. Let's try that now. In order to use our message component into other components like the app component here, we need to import this component first. So we say import message. And as soon as I type the name of the component, my code editor offers me to autocomplete the import statement. I will just hit return or enter to complete the statement. Now, as you may notice, that it gives us a warning that says, message is declared but its value is never read. This only means that we have the import statement here, but we are not using this component anywhere. For now, let's replace the h1 tag here with the message component. We use the component just like an HTML tag like this, and just like that, the warning goes away. And let's test this in our browser. And now the message component is rendered in the page. What is a React fragment? A React fragment is a feature in React that allows you to group a list of children elements without adding extra nodes to the DOM or the document object model. In React, components must return a single root element. However, there are cases you might need to return multiple elements. Fragments let you wrap these elements without adding extra nodes, like a div to the DOM. Using extra divs or other HTML elements to wrap child components can lead to bloated HTML, styling issues, and other unnecessary DOM nodes. Fragments help you avoid this by not producing any actual DOM element. They are particularly useful when rendering lists, tables, or other group of elements. Let's see how React fragments are used in a React component. Let's use the project we worked on from the previous lesson. Here, we have the message component returned by the main app component. Let's delete this for now and replace it with an h1 tag that says Hello React, and a paragraph tag as a second element that says a React paragraph. As you can see, our code editor is alerting us about an error because we have this red squiggly line underneath our return statement. Now let's try this in the browser and see what it gives us. In our browser, it immediately flashes an error dialog that says adjacent JSX elements must be wrapped in an enclosing tag. Did you want a JSX fragment? The error says. This is because in our code, we are returning two elements instead of just one root element. This is not allowed in React. To fix this, we need to enclose these two elements in a fragment, and I will show you a couple of ways how to do this. I am going to copy these two elements and wrap them inside a fragment component. Notice that our code editor helps us to autocomplete this by showing us the available options. Hit enter or return to complete the statement. Our code editor automatically imports the fragment at the top of our document. I will put a new line and paste the two elements inside the fragment component. Now, once you save this document, our editor is going to automatically format our code, because again, we set up prettier from the previous lesson, and it also adds the opening and closing parentheses enclosing the fragment component. Let's go back to our browser and test this if it's working. And sure it did. Just a side note, you can actually use a div tag to wrap the elements instead of a fragment component. Let's test this once again if it's still working. And it does. So, if a div tag can do the job, then why use fragment? Well, just like I said from the beginning of the lesson, adding an extra element to wrap the child components or elements is generally not recommended because it adds additional markup to your code. Using fragment, even though it looks like you are wrapping the elements around a tag or a component, the React DOM doesn't actually add extra elements to your markup. This will prevent bloated HTML when it is rendered to the DOM. Let's revert it back to be fragment. I will show you another way to use fragment in your component. So instead of importing the fragment component to your code, we can use a shorthand, like this. It is like an empty HTML tag. Just the opening and closing angled brackets are wrapping our child elements. This is exactly the same as using the fragment component, the one we imported. We can now delete the fragment import at the top. Let's go back to our browser, and as you can see, it still works. Just like before, we can render the message component here. Let's go back to the browser again, and everything still works. In this lesson, we're going to learn how to display list of data in React. I am going to create a new project for this one so we could start on a clean slate. You can also create a new project if you want to. Now, I'm going to fast forward this video because this might take a while, and so you can also start quickly. After the installation, let's open our project. And first, let me quickly set up my prettier config, so the code will be auto-formatted every time I save the file. Okay, let's delete everything from the app.esx file so we could start fresh. Let's create our app component. So let's create an array of data that will be rendered on the page. Let's define a constant here, const for short, and I will name it dudes, because these are going to be the names of persons. So now, the dudes variable is highlighted with a red squiggly line which says this value is not yet used. That's okay. So basically, this is a simple array of strings. For this lesson, we will learn how to render these strings on the page. Let's give this list a title. For example, how about handsome dudes? And let's put our title inside the fragment component as we learned in the previous lecture. Once I save the file, Prettier will automatically format the code for me as expected. Since this is a list of strings, let's put it inside in an unordered list tag. Now, in order to render the dynamic data on a React component, we need to wrap this inside the curly braces. Because in React, anything you put inside these curly braces are considered a JavaScript expression. I'll give you an example. If I write a mathematical expression here, for example 1 plus 1, and let's check it out what it gives us in the browser. I'll run my development server first. And as you can see, there's the title, handsome dudes, and the number 2 printed out. So React treated it as a JavaScript expression and performed the calculation. You can also hard code some data here like hello React for example. And if you noticed, when I save the file, the double quotes is converted into a single quotes. Because if you remember, we set this up inside our Prettier config file. Okay, so now with that in mind, let's render our array of data as list items. In order to do that, we're going to use the JavaScript map function. This function is not unique or exclusive to React. This is actually a JavaScript function. This function will take each item of the array or loop inside of this dudes array and convert each item in the list to something else. So for example, let's name each item in the array as dude, singular. Because we are taking them one by one, and then the arrow function, and let's put each item in the dudes array inside a list element since we wrap this inside an ordered list tag. And now we are going to put a pair of curly braces again because we are inputting dynamic data. And let's put the dude item here, like this. Again, when I save the file, Prettier will format the code for me. So now, we have our list of data rendered on the page. Let's remove the default styling for now. Okay, that's better. Next, I want to show you a bit of an issue here. If I open my browser development console, you can open yours by right-clicking on the page and click Inspect, or you can use the F12 shortcut key. If you go to the console tab, you can see the error message. It says, each child in a list should have a unique key prop. What does it mean? In React, if you have a list of data, you need to give each item a unique key. React requires a unique key for each element in a list to provide a stable identity for each component in the list. This is important for DOM manipulation, preserving state, and component identity. So let's go back to our component and let's give each item a unique key. We need to put this in the list element itself. Let's say key equals sign and the curly braces again. Since each item in the array is unique, we can use the item of the array itself as a key. Let's test this in the browser. Let's refresh the page, and there you go, the error is gone. But let's go back to our code editor because I want to show you another issue here. What if I change one of the values in the array with the same values as one of the items in the list? Let's see what will happen. We got another error which says, encountered two children with the same key. This happened because we set the key in our list tag to be the name of the item itself. So if we got a duplicate item in the array, we will end up in the same error as before. In a real-world application, this data typically would come from a database source and should have a unique ID for each item. In our case, we only have a simple array of strings. But we can get the index value of each item in the array and use that as the key for each item. Here's how we can do that. We can include the index as the second parameter in our arrow function, like this. Then we can use the index as the key to our list. Let's try that in the browser. Let's refresh the page, and sure enough, the error is gone. And in our list item, it's rendering the duplicate item. But React treats that as a different item, even though its value is the same. Let's bring back the duplicated item in its original value. Test it once again, and it still works. Now, we are going to learn about conditional rendering in React. I scaffolded a new project. By now, you should know how to create a new project using Vite, so I'm not going through it again to save some time. Let's create a new list of array called languages. This is a list of programming languages. Now let's display our list on the page. Let's loop through our list and put each item in a list tag and add a header at the top. Let's try this in the browser to see if it works. Okay, great. Now I noticed that I forgot to put the list tag inside the unordered list tag. You can highlight this and press Command-Shift-P on the Mac or Control-Shift-P on Windows to launch VS Code's command dialog and look for this command. Wrap with abbreviation. Press Enter and type the HTML tag you want to wrap your code with. I'm going to put a horizontal line here to separate the contents. And let's say languages.length equals 0, then a question mark. This is like saying if the languages has no contents or the length is 0, then let's put a message in a paragraph tag. If the languages array has contents, let's say null, or it's like saying don't put anything on the page. Let's try this on the browser. As you can see, there's our list of items and the horizontal line, and below that, we don't see any output because the array has items in it. Now, let's try to make the languages array empty. Here, we manually make the languages array empty for now. Go back to the browser, and now we see the message below the line. We can actually make this statement better. I'm going to copy this one below. Let's comment this out. We can eliminate this null statement and replace the question mark to an AND operator. This means that if the languages array is empty, then display this error message, and if it's not empty, then do nothing. In this example, we don't need to explicitly say null here. When we refresh the page, it gives us the same thing. But in my opinion, it's a bit cleaner than the previous one. Let's bring back the array to its original state. And let me give you another example. Let's say languages.length is greater than 0, question mark. Then let's render a paragraph tag. Then inside, let's put a total number of items. And if the array is empty, let's do the same thing for now. Let's check this in the browser. Yes, it shows the number of items in the array. If we declare an empty array, then it shows 0. Go back to our code, and here we can just simply say 0 here. No need to make a statement here because the array is empty anyway. Or you can change the message output if you want. One quick note. You cannot use any JavaScript conditional logic inside the curly braces like this. For example, an if statement like this. This is not allowed in React. If you go to the browser, you'll see an unexpected token error. You can use other conditional statement or other JavaScript statement in a function inside your React components. We will take a look at that in the future lessons. Okay, let's talk about handling DOM events in React. In React, Each DOM element supports different kinds of events, and one of the most used event is the onClick event. Let's try this in our list item. Type onClick, and as soon as you type, you see VS Code is helping us to complete it. One way of specifying a logic when this list item is clicked is an inline statement here on the element itself. In this example, I created an arrow function. Then I will just show an alert box with a message. Let's try that now. Well, I forgot to bring the array back to its original state. Let me fix that real quick. Our array list is back, and let's try to click one of the items. And it worked. Let's try to click the other items. Good, it's working as well. Now let's try to put dynamic data in the alert dialog. Here in our example, we are looping inside of this array. We can pass the language item inside our alert. Let's test this. And as you can see, every time we click the item, the alert's content is the name of the item in the array. Let us quickly add some styling to our page. For this example, I will be using Tailwind CSS to quickly add some styles, so our page doesn't look very generic. Go to Tailwind CSS website. You can go to this URL, and it will take you straight to Tailwind CSS v documentation. And the installation is very simple. We already did this step when we install our React project, so there's no need to do this again. What we want here is to copy this block of code. Let me stop the server first. Paste this here and run it. Let's start the server again. Then copy the config file and paste it into our Tailwind config file. Lastly, copy the directives to our index.css file. Delete all the default styling and paste it here. And of course, we need to uncomment the index.css file from the main.tsx file because we commented it out in the previous lesson. Back to our code. Let me wrap all of this with a div tag. Then I will quickly apply some styling here. Now, in React, when you are writing the keyword class in an element, you cannot use the word class itself because this is a reserved keyword in React. To add classes to an element in React, we say class name with a capital N. This is a camel casing, by the way. Now let me write some styles very quickly to center the elements on the screen. Okay, good. And let's also add some style to our header and a little bit of padding to our list item. Go back to the browser, and good, it's now centered. Let's clean this up a bit so our code base is not cluttered. Okay, now, let's go back to our topic. On the onClick event, we are currently doing is an inline function here. Although it's okay for a short piece of logic like this, it's not ideal when your logic grows when you are working on a real project. What we should do is to extract this statement and put it in a dedicated function, right here. Let's create an arrow function here called handleClick. Then put the alert dialog inside of this function. And then, in the onClick function on the list tag, we can reference the function we just created, instead of calling it on the onClick function itself. For now, let's change the content of the alert. Let's test this. And as you can see, it's still working. Next, let's try to pass the item in the array as a parameter of our function, so we could display the language name in our alert dialog. To pass a parameter to our function and onClick event in React, we can do it like this. And we still need to do this in an arrow function. Because without the arrow function, if you write the handleClick alone, the function would be called immediately during the rendering process, not when the click event occurs. Okay, let's put the language parameter here in our function, and since we are using TypeScript along with React, it's recommended to define what type of data this is. In our case, the language parameter is a string. This could be a number, a boolean, a float, and so on. And now let's put the language inside the alert dialog. And it still works. Great. Now, since I've mentioned about TypeScript a while ago, about specifying the proper type for our parameter, let's quickly talk about TypeScript and how it helps us write better code. To demonstrate this, let me remove the language parameter for now. And let's replace this with an event parameter. And let's quickly log the event to the console. On the browser, let's open up our DevTools. And it looks like I forgot to add the key attribute to our list item. We'll fix that later on. Let's go ahead and click one of the items. On our console, we see this synthetic base event. This is one of the built-in classes in React. If you look at the properties of this object, you see different properties here like client X and client Y, which represents where did the click occurs in the browser. Going back to our code, let me quickly fix the key prop error. Okay, the error is gone. Now, let's give the event parameter a type. The type of the event should be mouse event, because events are triggered in response to user interactions with the mouse, such as clicking, double-clicking, moving the mouse, pressing a mouse button, etc. Now when we press return, the mouse event should be imported at the top. Now the good thing about using TypeScript with React is it helps us catch errors early in the development process, significantly reducing runtime errors, enhances autocompletion, IntelliSense, and code navigation in code editors, and so on. Now we noticed when I put a dot after the event parameter, it gives us all the available options of that event, just like we saw from the console output right here. In this lesson, we will learn about component states. I have made some visual enhancements to our component by adding border and line divisions to our list, along with some padding. I will provide the source code for you to download and follow along. But it's essentially the same component as the previous lesson, with just a couple of classes added. This is what our list component will look like. So the idea is, when you select an item, it will be visually indicated by changing the background and text color. Back to our code. We have a list item with an onClick event. When this item is clicked, we need to store the index of the clicked item in a state. This way, React will have access to the index value of the clicked item. Let's begin by setting a variable called selectedItem, and we initialize its value to null. Now, we'll use a conditional statement in the class name. Using a ternary operation, we'll compare the selected value to the current index. If they match, we'll apply classes with a dark gray background and white text color. If the selected variable is not equal to the current index, however, no background or text color classes will be applied. Let's test this in the browser to see the result. If nothing changes, let's go back to our code and try changing the value of the selected item to 0 instead of null. Let's test this one more time. However, nothing seems to be changing. What's going on here? Let's go back to our code and examine the onClick event. It appears to be fine. However, the problem lies with the selected item variable. Although we have declared a variable here, React is not aware of this data. Because this variable contains data that might change during the life cycle of the component, In our case, we are using this data to track the selected item in our list. So we need to tell React that this is a dynamic data that might change. For this, we need to use one of the built-in functions in React called useState. So to do this, we're going to put this variable to an array, and a second item called setSelectedItem. The first variable in the array is the selected item variable, which is now a state in React that contains a value that might change over time. The second item, which is the setSelectedItem, is called an updater function. By convention, updater function in React are written like this, in a camel casing with the word set at the beginning. And we will put this in the useState function. And we need to tell the initial value of this state. In our case, it's 0, the first item in the array. And let's make sure that we imported the useState at the top. Let's delete the handleClick function and the onClick event handler in our list for now. Now, let's try this in the browser. And this time, as you can see, it worked, and React is now aware of the state of our selected item from our list. Let me quickly fix the selected item here because it is overflowing from our list container. Okay, now that it looks good, it's time to create the functionality where the selected item class is activated when the user clicks on one of the items in our list. To achieve this, re-add the onClick event handler to the list item, using the updater function, setSelectedItem, and providing the index value of the selected item. Wrap it in an arrow function as before. Now let's see this in the browser. This time, as you can see, the list item is properly selected when clicked, and React remembers which item is selected by highlighting it. Let's try to change the initial value of our state to 1, which should be the second item in our array, which should be PHP. Let's test this, and sure, it worked. One more time, select the third item, which is Python, and it's working as intended. Let's bring this back to the first item. Now, the good thing about state management in React components are states in a component works independently with one another when the same component is used in other areas of your app. To demonstrate this, let's create a new component called listComponent.tsx inside the components folder. And now I want to show you a shortcut for quickly scaffolding a new component structure. Type RAFCE. As you can see, your editor will provide the IntelliSense snippet. This is called React Arrow Function Export Component. Select this one, and as you can see, it quickly creates the initial structure for your component. Please note that this shortcut will only work if you install the ES7 Plus React extension we discussed in the Setting Up Your Development Environment lesson. Let's remove the unnecessary React import for now. Go back to our app.tsx component and copy all of its contents to our new component. Make sure to also copy the array and state variables. Additionally, copy the import statement for useState. Next, delete the copied code, including the array, state, and used import from our app.tsx component. Essentially, we have moved everything from our main app.tsx component to a new component called listComponent.tsx, which is more appropriate for its purpose. Now, let's make use of our newly created component. We will import the list component here in our main app component. Let's test this in the browser. As you can see, it still works. Now let's duplicate this component so that they are stacked on top of each other. In the browser, you might see only one component. But if you look at the DevTools, you will actually see two components stacked on top of each other. We just need to fix the styling here, because the second component is directly behind the first one. So let's wrap these two inside a div and make this as a flexbox container. and remove the hScreen class in our list component. Now, let's test this once again. And as you can see, we now have two instances of the same component, but watch as I click on the items of each of this component. The selected item indicator is different from the other instances. This is how state components in React works. You can have two instances of the same component, but the states within those components are managed independently of one another. This is one of the powerful features of React, because you can build dynamic and reusable components across your application, so you don't have to rebuild the same component to be used in other places in your app. So here, we are showing a list of programming languages in our two components. Now, what if we want to pass different data to our list? Because right now, the two components have exactly the same data source. How can we make this component reusable? This is where we make use of properties, or props for short. Props are the inputs we pass to our components for dynamic contents. Back to our code. Instead of hard coding our data here, our goal is to pass this array to this component, similar to passing an argument to a function. The same can be said for our heading right here. Our title is hard-coded and not very dynamic. It would be much more flexible if we could pass different values, like various web frameworks, for example, or other data types. How can we achieve this? Initially, we must determine the structure of the input for this component. Therefore, we need the capability to pass an object that contains two attributes: items, which will be an array, and a heading, which will be a string. To accomplish this, we'll leverage a TypeScript feature known as an interface. An interface allows us to specify the structure or schema of an object. We begin by using the interface keyword, and then naming it. Conventionally, we use props, but some opt to prefix it with components names, such as list props or language props in our example. Both approaches are valid. I prefer using a shorter name. Inside braces, we outline different properties and their respective types. We aim to include a heading, which will be a string, and an item, which will be an array of strings. Here, we employ type annotation to define types of various properties. With this in place, let me delete this comment. Subsequently, we assign a parameter named props to this function, specifying its type as props. If we return to our app component and temporarily comment out the second list component, we encounter a TypeScript compilation error. The error message indicates that the type is missing certain properties required by props, specifically heading and items. The TypeScript compiler is alerting us that we have neglected to pass the necessary props, thereby aiding us in identifying potential errors during compilation before the application is executed. Returning to our list component, I plan to transfer the list of items to the app component. We can then pass these in a manner similar to setting attributes on HTML elements. Let me change the variable name to items instead of languages, because we made this change in the list component. Then, let's pass the items array to the list component. Remember, this is now a dynamic data, so we should enclose it within curly braces. Then we can pass our heading value like this. But since it's just a static value, we can omit the curly braces and simply place it within the quotation marks. Going back to our list component, we got a couple of issues. We don't have the languages variable anymore, so we have to prefix it with props, dot, and instead of languages, we say items. We also have to do the same thing with the heading. We say props.heading, and here we can leave the language variable as it is, but I think it's better to make this item instead of language, to better reflect that this is an item, singular, from the items, which is plural. We also need to change this. Now let's go back to the browser. And it's still working. I can select the items here and it works just fine. In the app component, if I uncomment the second list component and give this the same value as the first, in the browser, we see the same thing. That works. We can also select the items of the list components and the state changes for each. That's great. Now let's try to change the heading of the second component. Let's say frameworks. Now, the second item has a different header. Now, let's try to change the data itself. Let's copy the first array, and let's name this frameworks. Change the values of the array. You can try anything you like. Pass the framework as the props for the second component. Go back to the browser, and it works. Now the two instances of the same components have totally different data, and I can select each item as well. One final note, go back to the list components. As you may notice, we are using the props multiple times here. We can make this better by destructuring the props like this. Inside the curly braces and input the name of the properties, heading, and items. Now we don't need to say props here. And over here. Let's test this one more time, and it's still working. I can still select the items, and it's still working perfectly. Right now, our list component is working fine. We can click the items on both list component and their states updates independently. In real-world applications, most of the time, an action will be performed after an item is clicked or selected. This could be as simple as displaying a message in a dialog, going to other pages in your application, requesting data from external API sources, and so on. In our case, we don't want to execute the logic inside of this list component itself, because if we leave it as is, this is not going to be a reusable component anymore, because our data source in this example is defined in the parent component, which is the app component. We need a method to notify the parent component when an event is triggered or an item is selected from one or more items in our list. Going back to the list component, here is our onClick event handler. So what we want is when we click this item, we're going to notify the app component that an event was triggered, and then perform a certain action. To demonstrate this, we will send the item name to the app component so we could display that item to an alert dialog for now. This process is almost the same as passing data as props from the previous lecture, and fortunately it is very easy. So here in our props interface, we use this to pass data from the app component to the list component. We need to pass a third props here, which is going to be a function. Let's call this onSelectItem. We write this function in camel casing as props by convention, starting with an on, and then the name of the action. Then an arrow function, and void, meaning we will return nothing. Then we are going to specify the item as parameter, and this item is a string. Now, if we look at our code, it looks like we have no issues, because we don't see any squiggly lines anywhere in our code. However, if we open the Problems panel in VS Code, we can open that by going to the View menu, then Problems, or you can use the shortcut key. As you can see, we have some issues here. The issue seems to be coming from our app component. This is one of the benefits of using TypeScript. The TypeScript compiler is alerting us about potential problems in our code, even before we execute them. The error says the onSelectItem is missing but required in type props. Let's fix the issue. Close the Problems panel. Here in the parameter of our list component, we need to specify our third parameter, which is the onSelectItem. Now, let's go to our app component and fix the issue there. Now we see there's an issue in our list component. the onSelectItem function is missing. Since we add a third function parameter to our list component, we need to specify that here. Again, we can pass the function as an HTML attribute tag like the items and heading. And let's create a function local to the app component called handleOnSelectItem. And let's declare that at the top. Then pass the item with type of string as the parameter. Let's copy the onSelectItem prop to the second list component. Now, let's go back to our list component item, and let's make use of the onSelectItem function. Let's put that here inside the onClick event handler. Currently, we already have a function declared here, which is the setSelectedItem. To add another function here, let's wrap this in a curly braces. And let's put the onSelectItem at the bottom. And pass the item as the parameter. Let's try to open the problems panel again to see if we still got issues. One quick tip. When developing your applications, I recommend to make it a habit to always check your problems tab to see if there's an issue that needs your attention. As you can see, indeed we still have some issues here. It says the item is defined but never used. And the error seems to be coming from our app component. Let's go back to our app component. And yes, there's an issue here, because the item is declared as variable, but we never used it. Let's put this in an alert box to see if this will work. Go back to the browser, and yes, everything is still working. The app component is notified about the click event from our list component and displaying the data from the list component to an alert dialog. Let's break down the concepts of props and state within React, shedding light on their distinct roles. Props are essentially the parameters or inputs fed into a component, much like the arguments passed into a function. They dictate the component's display and behavior from the outside. Meanwhile, state represents the component's internally managed data, which can be updated over time, similar to variables within a function. The golden rule for props is to treat them as immutable, or it cannot change. When working with a component like list component that receives props, resist the temptation to modify these props. Even though React doesn't enforce this immutability, altering props directly contradicts React's functional programming foundation, and it's considered a poor practice. For example, let's go back to our code. Here in our list component, we have a heading prop. Let's try to change or mutate its value. Say something else. Let's check this on the browser. And look, the value of our heading was changed for both list components. This is an anti-pattern in React. I highly discourage you from doing this because props are intended to be a stable and unchangeable source of data for a component. In contrast, the state is inherently mutable, designed specifically for data that needs to evolve or change. The ability to change the state is what allows React components to be dynamic and responsive. It is React's way of acknowledging that a component's data might change, prompting the DOM to re-render the component and update the UI accordingly. Both props and state play pivotal roles in React's dynamic ecosystem, and from the differences between state and props, they only share one similarity. When the state or props changes, React automatically re-renders the component to reflect those changes in the UI. This shared behavior underscores React's reactive nature, ensuring the interface always accurately represents the current state and props of its components. In some cases, as our application grows, we need to pass additional markup to our components. For example, let's go back to our app component. Here, on the heading props, we are passing a literal string data here. What if we want to wrap this with an HTML tag, like an anchor tag or a paragraph tag? Let's try to wrap this with a paragraph tag and see what will happen. In the browser, look at that mess. The paragraph tag is printed out on the page inside the h1 tag. This is not what we want, but fortunately, React makes it easy to pass children to our components. Let me show you. So back in our code, let me remove the paragraph tag, cut the title itself, and remove the heading prop. Let's close the list component just like what you do when closing an HTML element, like this. And let me comment the second list component to get it out of the way, and the second array at the top, and paste the title inside of the list component. Now, the TypeScript compiler is notifying us about an error. Back to the list component, we need to change the heading prop, because this prop no longer exists. What we should do is to replace the heading tag with a children prop. The children prop is built into React. This will allow children to be passed down from the parent component. Let's do that now. Replace the heading with children. Now we need to change these two as well. Go back to the browser, and it worked. Now we are passing a children, which is a literal string for now, to the child component. Go back to the app component, and what if we want to wrap the title with an h1 tag? Let's do that now. And let me add some classes. And as soon as you do that, the TypeScript compiler is gonna yell at us saying that the children prop expects a string, but we just wrapped that string in an h1 tag. So it's not a valid string anymore. Let's fix this. Back to our list component. Instead of saying string here as the type declaration for our children, let's change this to React node. And make sure it is imported at the top. This is a class built into React which allows us to pass HTML element as children. Now everything looks okay. Go back to the browser, and it worked. Let's add an additional element as part of our header in our list component. Let's try a paragraph tag that should act as a subtitle for our h1 tag. Since we are passing an h1 tag already to our list component, we can delete the h1 tag there. Here in our list component, we can safely remove the h1 tag because we already passed this, and just say children here. Go back to the browser, and look, the paragraph tag is rendered on the page. Let's try to add another tag, say an anchor tag. And say this is a link. Let's change the text color. Go back to the browser, and it's also rendered on the page. This is the power of passing children to our component using React Node class. Using this, we can pass not only generic data like string to our child component, but we can also pass other HTML elements as children as well. When developing React applications, we can install a developer tool called React DevTools. This tool is very useful for inspecting your React components and debugging. It is a browser extension available for modern browsers like Chrome, Firefox, and others, with the exception of Safari if you're on macOS. You can search for React DevTools on Google, and it should appear as the top result. This will direct you to the page where you can install this extension. I have already installed mine, so let's return to our list component. Open your developer console by pressing the shortcut Ctrl F12. If you don't see this extension immediately, just refresh your browser and you should see the components and profiler tabs in your developer console. Let's go to the Components tab, where you can see the hierarchy of your components. Here, we see the app component, which is the root component. On the right side, you can view the props of this component and other details, such as which component is rendering it and the source. When I click the list component, on the right, I could see the props we passed to it, the array of items, and so on. If your application contains a bunch of components already, you can filter the names of the components from the search bar. As you can see, it highlights the component you search for. making it easy to navigate between components if your application already contains many of them. You can also click on this right icon right here to see how the component is rendered in the DOM. When you go back to the Components tab, you can check the source for this component. It will show you the actual React code for the component, as well as the directory structure on the left side. Most likely, all React developers make use of this very useful extension, so I highly recommend using it, as it will certainly improve your development experience and be tremendously helpful for debugging purposes. Now, it's time to put what you learned from the previous lessons to practice. In this exercise, I would like you to build an alert banner like this one. So the idea is, when you click the Show Alert button, a custom alert banner will show up at the top of the button. I have provided a starting project for you. You can download the starting project from the resource link attached to this lesson, so you could start quickly. But you can create your own styles if you want. After you downloaded the starting project, which named begin exercise message box.zip, please make sure you run the npm install command on your terminal from the root directory of the project to install the dependencies, and then npm run dev to start the development server. Try to solve this on your own. I guarantee you that we have discussed everything in this section that will allow you to complete this exercise. However, if you get stuck or prefer to follow along as I build this, that's fine as well. Okay, now, pause the video and try to complete this exercise on your own. Or you could resume the video and follow along. Okay, it's time to build this. So our goal is, when we click this button, we will show the alert component right here on top of the button. So, the first step is to create a state in the app component, where we will store a value which will indicate if the alert component is visible or not. So say the state is show alert. Then the updater function will be set show alert. And we will use React's useState hook. Make sure it is imported at the top. And we will initialize this state to false. That is to say that the alert component is not visible by default. Nice. Our first step is done. The next step would be to conditionally show the alert component on top of the button based on the state. Let's make a ternary operation here. So if show alert is true, then show the alert component, else say null. Then let's put a static content for the alert component for now, so we could test this in the browser. Say in here, this is a test. Then on the header, this is a header. Go back to the browser. We see nothing, because our initial state for the visibility of the alert is set to false. Let's set this to true for now, so we could see this in the browser. And there you go. This is what the alert component is going to look like when the button is clicked. Let's bring the state to false again. Okay, for the next step, we need to set up the onClick event handler for the button to set the show alert state to true when clicked. Let's do that now. On, click, add the arrow function, then set show alert and set it to true. Let's test this in the browser to see if it works. Okay, nice. It worked. The next step is to pass our props to the alert component, which will be received from the app component. Let's create an interface at the top and specify the title prop, which will be a string, then the children prop, which will be a React node, because remember, we are going to pass an HTML element here. Next, let's pass the props to the alert component. We'll destructure the props Then place the title prop in the header and the children prop here. Moving back to the app component, we need to supply the alert component with the proper data to render on the page. Since we are going to accept children in the alert component, we cannot self-close the component like this anymore. We need a matching closing tag, like this. Then, as we learned from the previous lecture, we can improve this conditional statement. We can eliminate the null, and instead of the question mark, let's use the AND operator. Then, inside the alert component, this is where the children prop will go. Inside the paragraph tag saying React and TypeScript are cool. And don't forget the title. Attention, please. We learned from the previous lesson that we can check if our project has issues by opening the Problems panel. Okay, it looks like we don't have any issues. Now, let's test our work in the browser. Nice, it works. Congratulations on completing the exercise. And actually, before we go, why don't we extract the logic from the onClick event handler to its own function? So cut the setShowAlertUpdater function. Let's name this function handleShowAlert. Then at the top, let's create that function call. Then paste the stateUpdater function here. Go back to the browser, and it still works. In this lesson, we're going to discuss how to set optional and default values for a prop. I have attached the starting project for this lesson. Please download it and ensure that you have installed the dependencies by running npm install in the command line. Let's begin by opening the title component, which is included in the project files. Let us split our code editor into two columns so we can see our components at the same time. Then drag the title component into the second panel. Then close our file explorer so we could have a bigger space. In the app component, let's put the title component here. And let's run our development server. Let's check this on the browser. Okay, this is how it's going to look. Now, to demonstrate how to make a prop optional, let's create a prop for our title component. I'm going to make a text color prop and declare its type to a string. And of course, we need to pass this prop to our component to make use of it. Back to our app component, pass the text color prop. Let's make this a blue color. I am using a utility class from Tailwind CSS here. Now, let us include the text color class to the h1 tag. Right now, the classes for our h1 tag here is a string, but we need to pass a prop here, which is a dynamic data. So how can we pass a dynamic prop into the classes of our h1 tag? Here's how you can do this. Let's cut the classes for our h1 tag, then curly braces. Then inside the curly braces, we need to add a pair of backticks here instead of quotation marks. Then paste our classes here. Okay, now, to include the prop here, we need to use a technique called string interpolation in JavaScript. We need to type the $, then curly braces. Then inside of these curly braces, this is where we should put our prop. String interpolation in JavaScript is a technique for embedding expressions within a string. It allows you to insert variables, expressions, or function calls directly into a string. In our case, we need to put the text color prop inside the class attributes of the h1 tag, but putting a prop inside a string is not allowed in React, so we need to do that using string interpolation. And this is how you do it in React. Let's check this on the browser, and it worked. Now, in the app component, let's try to remove the text color prop. As soon as we remove the prop from the title component, TypeScript is giving us an error, which says text color is missing but is required in props. If we want to make this text color prop optional, meaning the title component doesn't require this text color to be passed by the app component, we need to declare this prop as optional. And the way we do that is simply just putting a question mark at the very end of the prop name, like this. It tells TypeScript that the text color prop is optional. And as you can see, the error goes away. If we go back to the browser, we see that the text doesn't render the color blue, but it still renders the text without any errors. But we can also tell TypeScript that there's a default value in case the parent component doesn't pass any value to the text color. To do that, here in our title component, let's specify a default value like this. This tells TypeScript that this is the default value for the text color to be used if none was provided by the parent component. Let's try that in the browser. And look, it renders the blue color to our header since we specify a default value to use. Now, I want to show you another trick. In our props declaration, we can pass a couple of options or allowed values to be passed into our text color prop. For example, instead of specifying a generic string type declaration here, we can use what is known as literal string, like this. Then a pipe symbol. This is called a union operator in JavaScript. And let's provide another value. And another one. So, in this example, we are providing 3 possible values to be accepted by the title component from the text color prop: blue, red, and gray. This tells TypeScript that we can either accept one of these 3 values we specify. If you try to change the default prop value here, it gives us an issue. It says the text orange is not assignable because it is not available from the options given. So let's bring this back to blue color. And let's try this on the app component. Let's give the text color a different value. And yes, it gives us the same error. Let's try another one, say purple. Check this on the browser. And it doesn't render the color. Let's bring this back to blue. And it worked. Perfect. This is another benefit TypeScript gives us. It allows us to be strict in data types or values we accept from our components, therefore improving our application's reliability. And we can easily find bugs in our code even before we run them. Alright everyone, that's it for this video. So we've covered a ton of ground in the last hour and a half, and hopefully you're feeling much more confident about React with TypeScript. But this is just the first taste of what's included in the full video series. In the complete program on Udemy, you'll get an additional 6.5 hours packed with even more valuable lessons and exercises. In-depth dives into specific topics we only briefly touched on so far. Lifetime access to the course so you can revisit the material whenever you need a refresher. New video lessons to be published in the future will be included for free when you purchase the course. So if you're serious about mastering React with TypeScript and taking your skills to the next level, then the complete course on Udemy is for you. And guess what? Udemy often runs sales, so you might be able to snag it for a fraction of the price. Head over to the course description below this video for the link to enroll. And don't forget to like this video, subscribe to my channel for more content like this, and let me know in the comments what other topics you'd like to see covered in the future. Thanks for watching and happy learning!